Welcome back, I am John P. Today we are going to be talking about Tudor watches and whether or not these watches are good. We're going to be talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now this is not going to be a video where I shame or bash Tudor in any way, but I'm going to be providing some information, some details, and also some specs on the Tudor watches and why I think they are actually pretty good. And also I'm going to be dispelling some myths for those of you that are unfamiliar with the brand or really haven't taken quite a deep dive into it. There's some things about Tudor watches I think that watch collectors need to know before pulling the trigger, both good and bad. Today we are going to be covering this. On the wrist today, I do not have a Tudor. I have a Breguet Classique. I love this watch. Beautiful Tiffany dial, actually co-branded Tiffany dial and retailed Breguet Classique in yellow gold. I love this. You can see more pictures of this watch and other watches in my personal collection, as well as what goes on behind the scenes at Del Rey Watch, where we buy, sell, trade watches, on my personal Instagram, The Real John P. So, Tudor watches, what's the deal? Are they owned by Rolex? Do they make great watches? Are some of the parts shared? Let's take a little bit of a step back and talk about where Tudor watches came from. Now, Tudor was a watch brand that was created by Hans Wilsdorf, the founder of Rolex, and the intent behind this brand was to create a more affordable yet reliable and precise timekeeping device that would be more approachable for the average person compared to Rolex in the time. Now, Rolex today is much more of a luxury item, but it was still top of the market when Rolex was invented by Hans Wilsdorf, founded and built out. Things like the Oyster case and other functions and features that were offered by Rolex watches made them more expensive than many of their competitors at the time. And so Hans Wilsdorf had this idea to bring a lot of the same principles across the board to watch not even enthusiasts at the time, but just watch consumers, watch purchasers, which was really everyone, right? We didn't have smartphones. So Tudor watches were intended to be a more affordable option than Rolex. And today, even the same sentiments can be felt. Though we'll talk about modern Tudor in a bit, but it is something important to note that Tudor was not always in the US market. For maybe upwards of a few decades, Tudor was just not really in the US market. Now, there was a time in about the year 2009 where Tudor came out with this Fast Rider and a couple of other models which really kind of led the charge for their re-entrance into the US market, followed by the Black Bay, which is really what we have today, and that's kind of the lineup that everyone knows and loves. But up until about the 1990s, there was a lot of cross-sharing of the parts, right? Tudor watches were notorious for featuring, for example, even the Submariner name. There was a Tudor Submariner. Now the dive watch would be considered the Black Bay, but Tudor did offer a Submariner, a direct comparison to the Tudor watches. Now, they also had a Tudor Date Day, which was the alternative to the Tudor Day-Date. And a lot of the models that Rolex offered, Tudor had something very similar. Tudor had chronographs, Rolex had chronographs. Now, it didn't look exactly like a Daytona. The configurations of the registers were a little bit different, but you get the picture. They had alternatives. Some of the parts were sharing things like crystals, the crown, right, to change the time or to wind the watch. They would have Rolex parts. Some of the casebacks would also feature Rolex casebacks. Even dating into the early Tudor watches, there was even some sharing of certain types of cases and even hands and dials and things like that for a period of time. So when you start digging into vintage from decades ago, you see these Tudor watches that look identical with some small exceptions to the unnaked eye or the more trained eye, but largely they had these alternatives, and that was the idea. So taking us into Tudor today, does Tudor make a good watch? Now, I think it's important that we classify what we're going to talk about into the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, straight off, first thing with the good, I believe Tudor makes a great watch. Now, many people are going to say, oh, Tudor is the poor man's Rolex. I don't believe that at all, right? We're still talking about watches that do fetch premium price points. We're talking about watches that are in the same realm as Omega. In fact, some of the Tudor watches feature the Matos certification, the chronometer certification, that goes above and beyond COSC certification and tests so many other different things like shock, precision, magnetic fields in the way that the movement is susceptible to magnetic forces. These things and others are tested above and beyond COSC certification, and that shows that Tudor is really trying to produce a really great watch. Now, do they? I believe they do. The quality, in my opinion, has been there through Delray Watch. I've been fortunate enough to handle so many Tudor watches, and I would say that in terms of the quality, which we'll talk about in a second, where I think they do fall short of Rolex, right? Why not? Let's compare Rolex to Tudor, in my opinion, and share where do they fall short, right? Because they have to fall short somewhere against Rolex, because Rolex, once again, still does own Tudor, and they're not going to produce a one-to-one exact copy for a brand that's always been affordable. We have to be realistic in our expectations here, but keep in mind, we're talking about a watch or a brand in a whole catalog of watches that is a fraction of the retail price and an even smaller fraction of the price compared to what the Rolex watches trade for out on the market. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind, but in my opinion, we can get somewhere maybe close to 80 to 90% of the quality of Rolex if you can look past a few certain things. Now that takes us into the bad, right? Bad, but not horrible, because keep in mind, we're looking at Rolex versus Tudor. Same company owns them. There's going to be some things missing. One of those things that is missing with the Tudor watches is there's a little bit less testing. Sure, the watches are Matos. Some of them are Matos certified, and they do have the in-house movements that Tudor has started producing, starting with the North Flag, and they've gone on to develop partnerships with some of the other in-house movement manufacturers, things like cross-sharing with brands, dare I say it, like Breitling, and some of the others when we start talking about the chronograph movements. But setting all that aside, we do have to recognize that there's going to be a little bit less testing. Rolex is known for putting all of their watches through the ringer to the utmost degree. That's what they're known for. Precision instruments that are able to handle, quite literally, climbing the tallest mountains in the world. That's what Rolex is known for. That's what they focus on. They don't focus on certain things that other brands do, and that allows them to focus on things like the testing. So when you get into a watch like Tudor, we have to consider there's going to be a little bit less testing. Now, the watches are still going to be on pretty much on par with everything else out there in the industry, but just know that there's a little bit less testing on the watches. So when you get the scenario like when the Tudor Black Bay GMT, Tudor Heritage Black Bay GMT Pepsi bezel came out a handful of years ago, there was some issues with the movements and the date changes and things like that, and some other reported issues that we've heard from customers. But keep in mind, that is not only the fact that Tudor's been working on their movements in a different track. They don't use in-house movements all of the time, but circling back, what we see here is really just a byproduct of their less testing. But this happens with all of the brands in their echelon as well. So it's not something that I think we can really knock them against, but it certainly is a comparison that we have to draw when comparing, Rolex versus Tudor, right? And taking us into another, unfortunately, thing that's going to be a little less great is just going to be the feeling of the watch. Now, I know many people will say that that's not the case. It can be a little bit of objective, right? When we're talking about feeling, how does the watch feel on your wrist? But the reality is the watches in the cases are just not there compared to Rolex. When we talk about putting a Rolex on the wrist, we're talking about having nearly a century of perfecting the Rolex Oyster case and the bracelets. Rolex has basically only changed their bracelets a little bit over the decades and decades and decades, and that's something that this continuous improvement that Rolex uses, that's something that makes the Rolex Oyster and Jubilee bracelets so comfortable to wear, is they've perfected it a little bit as time goes on, and minor details, and they've worked out the kinks. When we're talking about newer bracelets, sure, they can do their best, but there's going to be little things like hair pulling. Sometimes I hear, but the lines and the angles are just not as nice on the wrist. In my personal opinion, Tudor compared to Rolex, but it's very close, right? We're talking in that 80%, Maybe some would even say 90%. So it's not quite there, but it's close. So when you start drawing the comparisons and looking at the price points, it can be a compelling argument to pull a Tudor. Also, dial construction, the dials are not going to be as rich feeling. Now, there are some Tudor watches where I might even take that back because of sporting reasons, right? Look at some of the Tudor Black Bays. They are very legible, something you'd really like in sporting or diving, and in which case someone may prefer the Tudor Black Bay over some Rolex watch that's not intended for the sporting. But when comparing the Submariner against a Tudor Black Bay, the Black Bay dials, in my opinion, are not quite there, but they get you pretty close. They move you pretty close along the way. And so that's something I think we have to consider is overall, the watches come pretty close, but there are these certain things that really do make a difference, but we're talking also a big difference in price point. Now, that's the good, that's the bad. Now, the ugly, in my opinion, with Tudor is it has nothing to do with the Tudor watches. I will say that I like Tudor watches. I think that they serve a lot of great purpose, and I think they're in line with a lot of what's in the industry today. I can't call them a Rolex watch. I can't call them an Audemars Piguet. I cannot call them a Patek Philippe, but they're not, right? They're younger, more docile, more agile. They test things in different ways in terms of stylings of watches. Tudor comes out with new product lines, right? Tudor comes out with new models. Rolex doesn't really do that, right? They might come out with a new dial variation, a new colorway, a new size, but Rolex is really not too often coming out with an entire new watch case and model and everything like that. They came out with the Skydweller, but they're not really coming out with a whole lot. And even the Skydweller basically looks like just a larger version of some of their other watches with extra complications, right? Leave your comments and responses to that below. I know I'll get a little bit for that. But when it comes to the ugly, I think personally, let me know if you agree, Tudor does a little bit too much pushing of the celebrities. And with this, makes their watches more expensive and becoming more expensive into the future. Now, they had a celebrity, Lady Gaga, a pop star. She was pushing the Tudor watches. She's no longer on their website, but they have a lot of other sports people and, they're more than just sponsorships, right? These are people that they put on their website. They focus a lot of their advertising around these pop culture people, these icons, these celebrities, and that comes at just such a big price point. I think if Tudor pulled back on this, they'd be able to offer an even better price, which makes a much more compelling argument for someone to hop into a Tudor, not necessarily against a Rolex, but perhaps up against an Omega, right? Looking at Mados certified watches, sports watches, that's kind of where Tudor is playing. It's not necessarily like Rolex is competing against Tudor. Wouldn't make sense. They're competing against people, or at least trying to, like Omega, whereas Omega's trying to move up and compete against Rolex. But if they just pulled back on some of these celebrity endorsements and advertising with these people, I think the watches can become more attractive in terms of pricing. Now, I don't know if they can do that. They're newer to the US. They're still building out their product lines. They have a little bit of catching up to do, and it's ultra competitive in the watch industry today. So while I kind of pose this or present this as an ugly, it might just be what they have to do in order to build the branding. Maybe as time goes on, we already see some evidence. They pulled Lady Gaga out. Maybe we'll see them just build a very, very strong brand where they don't really need the celebrities, right? Look at Rolex. They have the celebrities that wear the watches. They've done some sponsorships. They do the golf. They do, tennis, all of that. But it's pretty rare that you see advertisements focusing on the person more so than the watches, right? It's like people know about Rolex, but you'll see, maybe a date just on a billboard, or you'll see a magazine, The Economist, and it'll have, an Explorer or something like that I think I've seen recently. So it's more focused with the Rolex on the watches, but they've got century-old brand compared to Tudor, very young comparatively to all their competitors in the US market. But what do you guys think? I know that Tudor can be polarizing, right? You get crowds of watch collectors that say, no, Tudor is the baby brother, or, not in my words, but sometimes it's presented as a poor man's alternative. I don't think so. I think Tudor does their own thing. It's owned by Rolex. They're in their own lane. They're trying to be young, cool, hip, make a nice sports watch for the most part. Some other offerings, But for the most part, I think they do a pretty great job. And I think it's really, in my opinion, it's unfair to make this kind of comparison of, oh, they don't do all this. So I wanted to share this with you, but leave your comments and opinions about Tudor watches below. I would love to see it and hear it. Please do not forget to check me out on Instagram, TheRealJohnP, and check out DelReyWatch.com, where we may have 1 or 2 Tudor watches. I'm not sure. These are actually pretty popular, so they fly off the shelf pretty quickly. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.